Hey everybody, welcome back. So we're picking up for the second part of our lecture on decolonization, where we sort of move from, okay, here was the colonial archetype to here's what happened in terms of economic development immediately following decolonization in the 1950s and 1960s, which is when a majority of sort of European colonies gained their, former European colonies gained their independence. So the basic idea heading into decolonization, there was a lot of optimism about what economic growth would look like in former colonies after the end of colonial rule, right? So if you have a governance system and an economic system that are so repressive and so extractive, where all of the gains from trade are being reaped by the European state, all of the politics are aimed at transferring wealth and allocating power to the colonial metropole, getting rid of that system, we should see rapid economic growth, right? Remove that kind of oppression and that kind of exploitation. Anything should be dramatically better than that, right? So expectations were that growth would really be quite good after decolonization. And frankly, it wasn't, right? It was very, very disappointing. Sort of, there were some relatively bright spots here and there, but overall, I think it's fair to say it was a disappointment. And that happened for quite a number of reasons. Part of it being that economic growth is frankly very hard, but there were a lot of other reasons that we'll sort of talk about. So at the moment, remember that under that colonial archetype, you have the colonies are producing raw materials. So they have a lot of farms or plantations, they have mines, right? They have sort of industries in place that are around agricultural and natural resource extraction, right? And the current system of trade is exporting those raw commodities to the former colonizer, right, and importing most of their manufactured goods from Western Europe, from the United States, right, from Japan to a certain extent. And during this sort of post-colonial period, the terms of trade are kind of shifting in the world, and particularly shifting in favor of rich countries, right, which is, say, in favor of manufactured goods. So raw material commodity prices are falling. During the 60s, commodity prices are sliding, right? And so commodities are declining in price relative to manufactured goods. So the terms of trade are getting worse for the colonies at this. So, you would think sort of, okay, we have this whole political system shifted, that's set up to make sure that all the gains from trade are going to the metropole. Now you have sort of more sort of market forces doing the same thing. Shifting a lot of those gains from trade toward the wealthier, more industrialized states. You also have a situation where, okay, political control by the colonial metropole is gone, but you have these powerful multinational firms that are negotiating deals with these new and relatively low capacity, initially fairly low capacity states that have taken over post-independence. So these governments in the post-colonial states, sometimes they're striking deals with the multinational corporations, which either in some cases due to explicit corruption or in some places sort of coercion and other sort of dynamics, you end up with deals that are quite beneficial to the multinational firm and not so beneficial to the citizens of these developing countries, right? So you have sort of in general this economic growth after decolonization being a disappointment, and you have, because you've got sort of the same patterns of trade entrenched, you continue to have kind of power inequities between both multinational firms and developing country governments, and between actually former colonizers, their governments, and the governments of these developing states. You no longer have former colonial control, but you have a lot of institutional and economic relationships with very clear power imbalances that look a lot like colonialism. So sort of formal colonialism is gone, but what's taken its place is something that frequently gets referred to as neocolonialism, right? It's sort of similar power dynamics, similar inequities in place without the formal apparatus of colonial control, right? So a lot of economic theory is then wrestling with, okay, how do we get economic growth going? So if sort of that initial sort of, if we just get rid of colonialism, everything will be better, when that doesn't yield as good of results as we might have hoped, then economists and political theorists are sort of thinking about, well, how do we get better economic growth going in these former colonies, right? And at this time, dependency theory is developed and really takes shape and has a lot of, develops a lot of currency in developing countries. And the idea of dependency theory is that there is a core set of wealthy states that are enriching themselves at the expense of peripheral states, which are developing countries, mostly former colonies, right? And that you have this international division of labor, right, with unskilled labor at the periphery and more skilled labor with more human capital in the core countries, right? And the key elements, so like so far so descriptive, right? But when it gets prescriptive and when it starts to make predictions, when dependency theory is arguing that peripheral states cannot develop due to their place in this world system, right? The system is viewed as static, meaning that peripheral states cannot join the core, right? And core states can't end up at the periphery, right? That this is a static system. And that poverty at the periphery is necessary to sustain wealth at the core, right? So those are some of the arguments that sort of go beyond kind of observation and make assertions about causal relationships and predictions. And then there's a set of policy recommendations that sort of comes out of this, which is that poor states should withdraw from the global economy, that this world system, sort of this neo-colonial world system, is stacked, the deck is stacked against you if you're a developing country. It's inherently an exploitive system, and the only way to get growth going is to withdraw from that exploitive system. And the sort of development strategy that goes with, that sort of comes out of this is what's called import substituting industrialization, which we'll talk about quite a bit. Okay. So dependency theory, this is a Marxist theory in its origins, right? And it does provide a very compelling explanation. Those descriptive parts of the theory that I was talking about, like this describes this post-colonial reality, this neo-colonial reality. And keep in mind that this neo-colonial reality was not predicted by sort of kind of more neoliberal economic theories. They were sort of like, hey, yeah, get rid of the colonial system, open up to free trade if you're one of these colonies, and life's going to be great. We're going to get gains from trade. You'll be capturing some of those gains. Growth will be good, right? So the predictions being made at that time by kind of traditional liberal economic theory were not panning out very well. You've got dependency theory that comes in with a much more compelling explanation of events as they are unfolding, right? But then dependency theory kind of hits problems with its predictions going forward from there, right? And that sort of evolves over time, where we see quite a few states move from the periphery to the core. I think good examples of that would be places like Singapore, like South Korea, right? Where that transition, these are now quite wealthy states kind of at the core. And then, and in particular, the key thing here is that, and we're going to be contrasting import substituting industrialization, which is sort of what's prescribed by dependency theory, with export-oriented industrialization, which is more sort of the Washington consensus view about how you should go about development, right? Sort of at least more consistent with that view. The Washington consensus would say that you wouldn't do really any active industrial policy, but at least it is more of the sort of free market oriented, or at least more market oriented. I shouldn't say free market oriented, but market oriented sort of version of this, right? So we're going to compare and contrast those strategies. And import substituting industrialization, you do get industrialization, but in terms of kind of fully leading to long-term development, ISI is generally viewed as not having been terribly successful, right? And the poor countries that have developed most successfully, kind of the Asian tigers and these sorts of states that you hear about, kind of the South Koreas of the world, and the Taiwans and places like this that have really rocketed from the periphery into the core, that's mostly been wealth that's driven by trading heavily with the core, right? Exactly the exploitive relationship that dependency theory said you had to withdraw from in order to generate economic growth, right? And so the core prescriptions of import substituting industrialization, sort of if you following from dependency theory, if you're going to take that seriously and put your sort of turn that into policy and turn that into a growth strategy, you're going to start by taxing agriculture, right? Which is, so remember, after decolonization, your industries are really in natural resource extraction and ag. And so you're going to tax ag, and then you're going to subsidize key industries that you're trying to develop in terms of manufacturing and this sort of stuff. You're going to subsidize industrialization, and you're going to protect those new manufacturing industries with high tariffs, right? So you're not going to, remember, we're withdrawing from this exploitive trading relationship with the center. So we're going to put high tariffs that block those manufactured imports from the center, protecting these new industries that we've created. And what we're doing is we're aiming for self-sufficiency, right? You're trying to pull out of that exploitive world system by pursuing autarky, right? Self-sufficiency. So you're trying, the industries you're trying to develop are specifically those where you're, if you were importing all of your bicycles from Western Europe, you're putting in a big tariff in place on bicycles, and now you're trying to build all those bicycles domestically. You're specifically trying to import, you're specifically trying to create industries that replace the things that you used to be importing, right? And by the 1970s, the developing countries that followed this strategy really were quite self-sufficient in manufacturing. You could buy you could buy a Brazilian car and a Brazilian dishwasher, right? But the costs were that these industries turned out to be fairly inefficient, produced relatively low quality goods, and the temporary subsidies, so we talked about this with industrial policy in general, active industrial policy in general, that temporary subsidies have a tendency to become permanent. And most important and sort of most limiting in terms of long-term growth is you're not reaping many of the gains from trade, right? To the extent that you are engaging in successful import substitution, your trade volume is going down, right? Your specialization is going down. You're doing a lot of different things. So you have, so what's nice is you're not putting all of your eggs in one basket, right? But you're also not specializing in what you're best at, and so you're losing out on a lot of gains from trade. So the flip side of that, kind of the opposite end of the spectrum here, and obviously, like we're talking about archetypes, countries are there are countries that are sort of kind of doing a little mixing and matching here, but the other archetype here on the other side of things, so this is sort of think Taiwan and South Korea, especially South Korea is really like, I think that's the example of like anchor in your mind. It's very similar in many ways to import substituting industrialization in that it's similarly active industrial policy. And just like ISI, we're starting with taxing agriculture and we're engaging in wage repression here, right? So we're creating these new manufacturing industries, but this is not like a pro-union, high-wage kind of environment. This is very active wage repression. This is not sort of warm and friendly policy here. So you're taxing agriculture, repressing wages, because that's going to get you your comparative advantage globally, is these low wages. And you're subsidizing key industries again. But the key difference here is you're subsidizing industries for export. So instead of, if you were pursuing ISI and you're making those washing machines and those bicycles, you're making them for the domestic market. You're trying to replace imports and sell domestically. Here, you're taking things, you're picking industries that you think you can be globally competitive in, and you're making these things for export. The goal for each of these new industries is not to replace imported goods and sell to your domestic market, but to take what you're making and sell it overseas primarily, right? This is the national champions model. And this is where companies like LG and Samsung kind of come out of heavy protections and subsidies initially from the government, trying to turn them into export powerhouses, right? Trying to make them globally competitive global brands, right? Okay. So cheap labor is the key competitive advantage here. You're taxing the farmers who can't leave the land. You start by taxing farmers because generally they're growing for subsistence as well as for market, right? Like they don't have the option to stop farming. They're easy to find. It's very hard to hide agricultural production, right? It's growing out in plain sight. So it's a very easy group to tax logistically, right? And they can't go anywhere. So it's this is not a warm, friendly rationale, but both ISI and export-oriented industrialization start with taxing agriculture and subsidizing industry. It's just different which industries they're subsidizing. Are they import substituting or are they export-oriented? Government investment is helping develop higher value-added industries, right? So like South Korea starts with really simple low-end manufacturing, but then is also investing in building human capital and building capacity for higher end, higher tech manufacturing, right? Moving up into eventually kind of like R&D on smartphones, right? Where they're not just building smartphones, they're designing smartphones, right? Okay, and this government intervention has its risks, right? the same thing that picking winners is really hard, temporary subsidies tend to become permanent, corruption distorts government choices, all of those risks apply to export-oriented industrialization every bit as much as import substituting industrialization. The key difference is that one of these involves maximizing the gains from trade, and the other one involves sort of foregoing the gains from trade in order to avoid this exploitive world system. So import substituting industrialization, like as a strategy, didn't die out easily, right? And it really wasn't, so you've done some successful industrialization. You've built a washing machine industry and a car industry and a bicycle manufacturing industry domestically in places like Argentina and Brazil. And each of those becomes an entrenched domestic political interest. You've got a lot of manufacturing workers in those sectors. And so they're in manufacturing industries that are not globally competitive, but are providing goods for the domestic market and are functioning, right? And these are jobs people have, and they don't want to lose them, right? And so it really wasn't until the 1980s debt crisis that a lot of Latin American countries moved away from import substituting industrialization as a strategy. And we're going to talk mostly about that after we've gone through the international finance section and when we're kind of talking about the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, right? Because that's the actor that really kind of came in as a lender of last resort during this debt crisis and bailed out some of these governments while forcing them to change their trade policies, right? And so we want to sort of go through because the debt crisis was what sort of kicked this off. We want to go through the international finance section and the section on debt crises and the section on the IMF to kind of get the tools to do the full picture of kind of the end of import substituting industrialization in Latin America. But I do want to sort of I want to foreshadow the Washington Consensus, which is sitting behind a lot of this stuff. And I sort of mentioned it when I was talking about the Marshall Plan in Western Europe. What is this sort of Washington Consensus, this kind of neoliberal policy mix that is associated with the United States as a primary advocate for this on the global stage. So this is about liberalizing trade, so getting rid of tariff subsidies, quotas. It's about privatizing state-owned assets. So one of the features of active industrial policy is often some of these companies in these subsidized industries are actually state-owned firms. In South Korea, a lot of in the early days, these big South Korean firms were owned largely by the military. In the Latin American case, you've got these state-owned enterprises in all the big sort of manufacturing industries. And certainly, you hear a lot about state-owned enterprises in the Chinese economy today. So the Washington Consensus says you should privatize all those state-owned assets. You should sell those companies at auction and let them be run in the private market. The government shouldn't be running firms. It's sort of the position of the Washington Consensus. They tend to prescribe fiscal austerity to fix current account deficits, which we'll talk about, trade deficits and sort of the difference between the current account and the capital account. That's coming up in a couple of lectures, but their austerity is kind of their solution to these imbalances. Austerity meaning cut government spending, raise taxes, right? So this is definitely like a small welfare state kind of prescription. And then opening up to foreign capital and foreign investment. So just as we're opening up to free trade, we're also opening up to free and open capital markets, which again, we're kind of foreshadowing here because we haven't really talked about capital markets yet. It turns out that these policies hurt a lot. If you're in an economic downturn and then you go and you add austerity, right? So this is people have lost their jobs and then you take away their unemployment check and their welfare and their government pension for elderly people at a time when the economy is already in the tank, right? That causes a lot of human misery. And when you have a lot of human misery, people tend to take to the streets, right? People don't like those policy prescriptions. And so you get a lot of political instability, right? Governments get overthrown. And so what you end up with is the Washington Consensus, and again, we'll be talking about this quite a bit after we've done the capital markets piece of it, but it's worth talking about just in this trade component, is that the Washington Consensus has in many contexts been a bitter medicine that only sometimes works. And the other piece that we're going to be talking about with the Washington Consensus is that you get different flavors of it implemented in different parts of the world. In particular, you get one flavor of it implemented in Western Europe and a different flavor implemented everywhere else. And there are a variety of reasons for that over time, but I don't think that just sort of fundamental racism should be overlooked as a significant driver of that. That white people in Western Europe get one version of it, and black and brown people in the rest of the world get a different version of it. So racism definitely drives how this set of ideas gets applied into policy. So if you look at the Marshall Plan after World War II, Europe was arm twisted into opening up their markets, dropping tariffs, and allowing a lot of economic integration within the continent, right? Privatizing some state-owned assets, letting currencies float. A lot of this kind of stuff was happening, and that the US was very coercive in pushing it. But it was paired with very large influxes of US foreign aid to cushion the downsides of this bitter medicine, right? To prevent this political instability. Right? If you look at the version, 25, 30 years later that's going on in Latin America during the debt crisis, you do not see the huge influx of aid to cushion the downside, right? It is also, so in the late 40s and the early 50s, late 40s when the Marshall Plan is kind of going into effect, the US is very concerned with the power of communist parties in Western Europe and sort of winning the battle for control of Western Europe with the communists, with the Soviet Union. So this is like the early days of the Cold War. And there are ideas to throw money at the problem and kind of cushion these downsides. In Latin America, we're doing a very, very different thing. Later, we're not throwing a lot of money at the problem. We are backing right-wing dictators against communist parties, but we're throwing military aid at this, right? And we're backing dictators that are running death squads, right? So we're taking a very different tack for how you defeat the communists, right? So it looks very different in different parts of the world. We'll see a similar contrast between how the International Monetary Fund handles the Asian financial crisis in 2009, or sorry, 1999. I'm getting my years quite wrong here. Sorry, the Asian financial crisis in 99, and what those bailouts look like, and the level of austerity present in those bailouts versus the level of austerity that's present, a decade later when they're dealing with the global financial crisis, right? Which is then, rooted in the United States and Western Europe. And when they're going into places like Greece and Iceland and Spain, and they're bailing out countries like that, when they're bailing out countries in Western Europe, a lot less austerity is being called for than a decade earlier when they were bailing out countries in Asia, right? So you do see this really disparate application of the Washington Consensus, which we'll be talking about, really to talk about the IMF bailouts in particular. Like we need the finance piece under our belts first, which is where we'll be headed here in a couple of lectures. So that's where we're wrapping for today, and I look forward to seeing you all in person.